Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
To put it simply, we're in the golden age of watching stuff because if you really do your research, there are tons of options out there. And you know what? If you are within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with once again. As always, my name is Dave Voigt. I am the host for this podcast where we talk to a wide-ranging variety of entertainment industry professionals and just pick their brain not only about current projects, the art form itself, state of the industry, what influenced them, how they got started, the whole 9 yards, and everything else in between. If you need to subscribe to this podcast, and we highly recommend that you do, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and you can find everything archived over at our YouTube channel at In the Seats. And there's always the social media. Please follow us at In the Seats or at It Podcast 1, we've got 2 for the podcast, over at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And most importantly, please visit us over at intheseats.ca, where our hardworking team is watching the latest and greatest and writing movie reviews and TV reviews for festival stuff, new releases, keep you up to date on current events and things we got going on, and all that fun stuff. But on today's episode, I talk with Cavan Campbell. He is the writer-director behind the short film Reciever, which is playing at the Real Asian Film Festival, which is streaming Canada-wide from November 12th through November 19th. It's available Canada-wide due to the issues surrounding COVID that the world's facing, and it is a fascinating little psychological horror just that really addresses just the internalized harm that women and professional caregivers can face, sort of especially in this day and age when these social care workers are overtaxed and stressed. And it really does kind of speak to just how terrifying real life can be sometimes, because it's a real world situation just taken a slightly bit past the realm into the unknown, which is really what the best horror and the best sci-fi comes from. And when we talked with Cavan, we asked about the film, his inspiration for it, how he got into the business, because he does have a day job, or a side hustle as he puts it, and just the importance of short film in general. And I hope you enjoy this one, because I know I did. Now, I mean, obviously, first off, not only congratulations on the short, but congratulations on being a part of Real Asian. I absolutely dug the short, because it's this real sort of simple concept, but it's kind of insidiously creepy all at the same time. Can you walk me through sort of the origins of the story?
Well, so just as a bit of preamble for your listeners out there. So Reciever follows Sriani, who's an idealistic and rather overtaxed Sri Lankan Canadian social worker on a single terrible work night. She's built her life around empathy and service to others, but constantly at the expense of her own desires and her own needs. So the question becomes, who is going to protect Sriani tonight when she's confronted over the phone by an insidious caller with the power to control her mind? So, as you can well imagine, the underpinnings of how the modern social work industry operates are pretty key to how the film works. And I had a pretty expert guide through that world, because my girlfriend Stephanie is a social worker.
There you go. Okay.
And she was actually working as a telephone counselor when Luke Higginson, my co-writer, and I first started working on Reciever. So through Steph's experiences, I got a real chance to see the level of emotional labor and empathy that's really expected from a social worker's employers as well as their clients. And the more Luke and I sort of dug into that and explored that, the more it kind of started to scare us in a way. The more it presented, a slate of like fears and dangers that arose from the whole concept of the commodification of empathy, which is really the bedrock of how the modern social work industry operates, And the more we commodify someone's empathy, the more that empathy can be weaponized against them. So as we started to unpack that, it became clear to Luke and I that we wanted Receiver to be a psychological horror film. And once that ideal genre had become clear, we got to thinking about the right matching metaphor to explore those ideas. And we hit on the concept of hypnosis, because a successful hypnosis subject ultimately requires a level of emotional investment that is pretty comparable to what is expected, as the default for social workers. So that's sort of the beginning of its inception. I think, if that's a clear enough trajectory there.
No, I think so, because I'm always kind of fascinated where these ideas get pulled from, and just obviously having it sort of next to you, quite literally, must have been an interesting experience, because I can imagine you're doing research and you're trying to dive in, but you're also being sort of very analytical on what your girlfriend kind of does for a living, and you're trying to sort of dissect it in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose in a way that sort of, operating on that fine line comes, well, I don't want to say naturally to me, because I think it's probably a skill I developed over some amount of time, but it's sort of just my natural inclination to work that way. I think particularly because I just tend to be a person who does a lot of research before I write anything anyway, right?
Right.
So even if my girlfriend weren't the jumping off point of inspiration for the project, I would probably be having very similar conversations with somebody else, to talk to them about their work and their lives and their views on the two,
Now, this is something I've always been curious to ask, because when you go through your IMDb, yes, you've got some short films, you've directed some stuff, but all of your credits, a lot of them say rigging electrician. And I'm always kind of curious how people get their foot in the door for the industry, because you work on a lot of big shoots, but did you go to school as a rigging electrician? Walk me through sort of the background, because I'm always kind of curious, because people think you go to film school and then you come out and you go make your feature and then you go to Hollywood. That's not necessarily the case. You need to get your foot in the door first.
Absolutely. And admittedly, this is just going to be my particular trajectory. I think everybody has a different way to coming to the industry. I think the more media saturated our environment has gotten, and the more type of media projects we're producing, the industry has gotten a lot more fractured. There is, we're now decades removed from there ever being, sort of a standard trajectory for how to get into the industry as a filmmaker. Everybody kind of has to find their own way. In my case, I did go to film school. I have a fine arts degree from Ryerson University in Toronto in film. But I started working as a technician. I originally started working as a set decorator and set dresser. And that was literally just to pay the bills, because the thing is, in school or just out of school, or even 20 years into one's career, it's exceptionally difficult to make a living as a filmmaker in Canada, to the point that unless you are working in television full time as a established TV director, or are staffing writers' rooms as a writer, you're basically not really making a living as a filmmaker in Canada. Everybody has a side hustle, to put it mildly. And the one early on that I got really interested in was lighting. I knew from going back to my film school days that I had no interest in being a cinematographer. Cameras didn't really, the tech aspect of camera work didn't really interest me at all. But the emotional component of lighting and how that is deployed to create tone and mood and to basically tell stories visually, I found very interesting. And it was also conveniently a rather acceptable way to pay my bills. So I started, working as everybody does on small things. And I was working as an electrician, and then moved up to a best boy and a gaffer on, music videos and small indie features. And about 10, 11 years ago, I took my card in IATSE, local 873, which is the technicians local of IATSE here in Toronto. And then from there, I just started working on, bigger studio shows. So
how do you think sort of having this experience behind the scenes has helped inform you as a filmmaker? Because I always find, especially when I talk to people, it's the people who have more appreciation for every element that it goes into making a film. Because I mean, it really does take a village, no matter the scale of the project, to make anything. Like, how do you think having this experience sort of helps you as a storyteller and a filmmaker?
Well, I think your point is bang on. That if you want to be a filmmaker, you have to have an idea what everybody does on set. Now, you don't have to be an expert in their jobs. If you are crewing your show, you're ideally hiring the best people for the job. So you don't need to know the lighting inside and out, but you need to understand what the lighting department does. You need to understand the challenges and the practicalities of every one of the dozen plus departments on set. You need to have at least a grounding in that. And I think my background working as a technician, primarily in lighting, but also at the set dressing end of things, and I've dabbled in a few other industries early on in my career, probably had the biggest effect on me in terms of efficiency and flexibility. Big budget shows are really big, heavy boats that don't move very nimbly. And that's, in a way, kind of by design. It means that there's a certain amount of stability kind of built into the scale that you are working at. But it means that you end up seeing ways of creating efficiency in your own project simply because you see the waste that sometimes exists when you're working on bigger shows.
Yeah.
And through getting the chance to navigate that really teaches you to prioritize, right? How to, distill your work down to its absolute essence and preserve the core that needs to be in the center of any scene. On a smaller show, you always end up having to make sacrifices on set because there is never enough time and there's never enough money. And that's the case on big shows too. There's never enough time and never enough money, but it gets compounded when you're working at lower and lower budgets. So for me as a director, seeing the range of how lots of different shows at different scales operate means that I am always building plan A, plan B, and plan C before I get to set. I try and have an escape route mapped out,
right.
Usually in advance with the help of my editor and my script supervisor, before I set foot on a stage, because I want to know at every turn exactly which shots we can afford to lose if time becomes tight.
And I mean, I think a lot of what you just said really does apply to something like Reciever, because short filmmaking isn't low budget, it's no budget. And it's one of those things where a lot of people, at least on the outside looking in, can lose sort of the appreciation for the art form. Because I mean, specifically, I think with your short, it looks fantastic. And there is a very strong sort of visual aesthetic to it. And I'm kind of curious for you. I mean, obviously you want to try to balance the emotional core of the story versus like the visuals that you want to put in, but like, how would you quantify yourself as? Are you more of a character-driven guy, or are you more of a sort of a visual storyteller, do you feel?
I mean, it would be a cliche to say kind of both, but let's put it this way. I aspire to be both as a filmmaker. When you're working on a low budget show of any size, completing the film is fundamentally a process of attrition. Sometimes you just have to put your head down and just keep traveling because that's the only way to get it done. And so sometimes you end up having to make choices on set that are purely practical in nature. Literally, I have to cut this shot, or I have to simplify this shot, or I have to X, Y, and Z just for the sake of getting our day, or coming close to getting our day. So what that ends up meaning is that you have to try and in advance sort of build yourself a buffer that takes into consideration the creative, knowing that eventually some of those creative choices might have to vanish in the face of practicality.
Yeah.
So for me, it's much easier fundamentally to cut things for practical reasons if we're talking about the visual stuff. Simplifying a shot or losing a shot is really, really simple decision to make. The choices I'm more loath to make and the cuts I am more loath to make on set are the cuts to character to actors, things that are going to lessen the impact for the emotional impact for audiences. So in the end, I suppose I start off trying to encompass both, but when push comes to shove, for me, the performance reigns at the end of the day. I will cut the shots I am happiest in prep to put together. I will cut in a heartbeat if it means I get more time on a pivotal scene, in a close-up on an actor's face that I know is really going to sell in the edit.
From your perspective, why do you think the short film form is important? Because I mean, historically, through festivals and even like big award shows, it almost feels like the short section, while it's given its due, it's almost put off to the side and sort of patted on the head. And I'm curious from your perspective, why do you think short film is important?
Well, I think it's important primarily because of its rather fecund qualities. We really wouldn't have the superstar filmmakers that we know professionally if they hadn't been making shorts. And by shorts in this case, I mean, for some people it could be industrial film, for some people it's commercials, for some people it's music videos, and for some people it's dramatic short films or documentaries. But the point is, you end up in a position that you have very few resources and ultimately even fewer expectations of you from the industry around you. So if you're doing it right, you are constantly taking chances, And I know that the grass is always greener on the other side. A lot of us, when we're making a low budget project, sit there and put our heads in our hands sometimes and think, man, this would all be so much simpler if I just had a studio behind me, if I just had more money, if I just had X, Y, and Z. But the reality is, the more money gets involved in a project, the fewer chances you have to take risks as a filmmaker. Yeah. So the risk-taking part of your career, which is fundamentally the part that teaches you what kind of filmmaker you are and what your strengths are, exists, I don't want to say exclusively, but exists for a lot of people primarily within the realm of short film. Because, to distill my answer down to the smallest components, shorts are where you can afford to screw up because you can swing for the fences every single time you're up at bat. You can't always do that when you're on a studio show. Or more to the point, to do that becomes a much bigger fight than it is to just keep swinging when you're there on set on a show that you're paying for yourself,
No, for sure. And I mean, in the creative realm, that ability to be able to swing for the fences, you're not going to be able to do it every time, but it has to be something that's there. And I mean, and that really does kind of feed the entire process, no matter what sort of size show you're working on, really. Because I mean, there needs to be sort of that groundswell. There needs to be sort of that hope for potential, if that's the right word.
Absolutely. And I think by doing that at a small scale, when expectations are low for the projects that you are producing, it teaches you to be comfortable making those risks within a professional setting. And people who are comfortable doing so can absolutely pull that trend forward into their professional work, where they are supported down the road with more money and more resources and a bigger crew to support them.
Now, for you, looking back, I mean, this is something I always like to ask people: is there a moment in your life, or even a movie, that you can sort of pinpoint as, that moment in your life when the light bulb went off and be like, okay, I want to be a storyteller, I want to do this. This is the moment that is setting me on my career path?
Well, I'm not sure if there's one distinct moment that I could pinpoint, but there's a person I can pinpoint, which is my dad. My dad is an architect, but he's a painter, and visual art was always suffused within our lives when we were growing up. And the writing component comes from my mom, who's a writer. But when it came to my dad, not only is he a visual artist, but he's also a giant film buff. So he was the guy who was introducing me to films, typically when I was too young to really properly appreciate them. Because, if you remember back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, CBC used to play super late night when virtually nobody would be up, used to play a slate of old classics. They would be playing old Powell and Pressburger films or Hitchcock movies, things like that. And my dad would be the one propping us up when we were children and infants at 3 a.m. to watch a Hitchcock film with them. So a lot of that fundamentally I know comes from my dad. It was my dad who when I was too young to really have a sense of what my career path was going to be, or probably when I was so young that I didn't even realize that human beings had career paths, my dad made it feel like making films were a thing that you could spend your life doing and a rewarding thing, even though he doesn't make films himself, but he made it feel real, So I don't think I can pinpoint a single film or a single moment, because there was an entire spectrum of about a decade and a half of films and moments that my dad was sharing with me when I was really, really young.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Now, I mean, given the state of the industry these days, and just the way that we consume our media, especially mid-COVID and lockdown and all that, do you think the art of film is going to take a bit of a hit, or as episodic keeps getting stronger and stronger, or is always going to be sort of this back and forth between sort of the art of episodic storytelling versus the art of making a standalone feature, be it a short or a feature length?
I don't like to make predictions because typically they don't age very well, and for me, making predictions usually ends up showing people my ignorance about issues. So I genuinely have no idea what's ahead of us for the world of film. But what I can tell you though is that I don't think it's helpful necessarily for filmmakers to be seeing there to be this storytelling dichotomy between episodic and television-based material and quote unquote cinema and films, because at the end of the day, we all need to be nimble and flexible enough to just tell stories. That's what you should be doing. I ostensibly got into making films to make films, but at the end of the day, the opportunities that are available for filmmakers within the world of television and streaming right now beat the hell out of the options that are available for people to get features made.
Yeah.
It is a tiny, tiny little club of people that get the opportunity and have the privilege to make feature films. So to try and sustain the critical mass of very good filmmakers that we have in Canada and within the industry, people have to be nimble enough to say, yeah, I will absolutely work in television if they will have me. I will absolutely work in episodic streaming if they will have me. Because that is kind of the only way, especially in Canada, where like your opportunities just for paying your mortgage are very limited when you're a film director who doesn't necessarily want to leave and go to the States. Then you've got to kind of work wherever the work will have you. And the thing is, there are far more opportunities now within episodic media than there are to get features off the ground. That to say, at the independent end of things, it is still ostensibly a little more real to produce indie films, simply because it's easier to pitch for money for films to some of the few remaining funds that are still available to fund independent works. It's a little more realistic to go and be seeking modest funding for an independent feature film than it is for an independent television series. So they kind of go hand in hand, and there is a bit of a back and forth, because the thing is, you end up producing media and cutting your teeth at the cinema end of things because it's easier to do that, but the greater job opportunities after that point, or perhaps contemporaneously with that point, are fundamentally within television and streaming now.
No, yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's complex times we're living in, and I mean, and there's something else that always, kind of pops into my mind, and I think Reciever does this quite well, is because there's always going to be the issue of representation for different cultures and making sure people are represented properly on screen. And I think Reciever does that, but at the same time, it's one of those films that isn't quote unquote trying to do that isn't being clunky about it. It's focusing more on people. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, how important is it to just sort of dial away any kind of issues that you may want to try to sort of, or hot button things that you might want to try to hit on when you're telling a story, versus just getting down to the fact that these are characters, these are people, let's find out about them?
Well, in a way, I almost don't see it as two separate processes, because I think if you're doing it right, you are always going to have an issue underpinning the story you want to tell. Otherwise, why are you telling the story, right? But if you're doing that properly and carefully, you are going to be doing that hopefully through the lens of telling a relatively unique story, of trying to tell a story about interesting people that we haven't seen so much of before. And the funny thing is, in this debate that exists about representation, for me personally, as somebody who believes in universal human justice, it is absolutely something that filmmakers need to work on and need to fight for, which is not just defaulting to a white male perspective,
right,
for the stories that we tell. But the other thing is, that can be a politically loaded statement that I've just made.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But it shouldn't be a political statement, but unfortunately we live in a world that makes it so. But the funny thing is, you strip the politics away from that statement, and for me, just as a film viewer, I'm tired of movies about white men. Yeah. I'm tired of every film being told through that lens, because I've seen these characters over and over and over again. These characters have fundamentally, now not every single character, of course, there's still writers who are crafting good work that involves male, Caucasian characters. But the idea of those types of characters being the default is boring. And those types of characters have become incestuous because people are basing them not off real people, but just on other characters they've seen in previous films. So for me, the aim of having a film that tries to do a better job with representation is simply that I want to tell a film that people haven't seen before. I want to spin characters that people don't feel like are just reminiscent of previous film characters that they've seen. And the thing is, there's not really been a character quite like Sriani, a Sri Lankan Canadian social worker at the head of a psychological horror film before. And that was the point that for me was worth fighting for. Admittedly, I also have a personal investment because I'm Sri Lankan Canadian, and I want to also see part of my own heritage reflected up on screen. But even if I didn't have that, I would want to be telling a story about people who we haven't seen a bunch up on screen, because that's the most interesting way of telling stories, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you're absolutely right, because I mean, as a white man, I'm sick of seeing stories about white men too. And I mean, when I watched Receiver, it wasn't the issue of her being Sri Lankan never even came to my mind until basically the end of the movie. And it was like, oh, I'm watching about this interesting character who is Sri Lankan. And that's more of the point when it comes down to storytelling, as opposed to the other way around, which is what some people want to make sort of the issue of representation being.
Yeah, I think my take on it is simply that it can be done properly or improperly, the same way that any facet of storytelling can be done. My personal view is that subtlety is ultimately better because it just makes for a better story.
Absolutely.
Some people view it differently, and I'm not going to take away from those people necessarily, because everybody has a different take on how they want to craft their stories and what they're trying to get audiences to take from it. It was appropriate for this type of film to have a bit of a softer touch when it came to this, and to play a little more subtly, just to sneak people into this awareness of Sriani's background,
right,
and how that has influenced how the events of the film and how she is taken advantage of by, in essence, the white male perspective of this caller. The subtle way that her life has allowed that to spin out.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, it comes down to the subtlety and the nuance that really makes it all that much more effective. And I think that's where you really succeeded with this film.
Oh, thank you. It's every time you try and be subtle with something, it's always going to be hard to know if it's actually going to work, because the thing about subtlety is simply it needs to be filtered through an audience to be able to tell you, am I doing enough?
Yeah.
And or am I doing too much? Because the thing is, the subtle awareness of like, when is the audience going to pick up on some of these issues that you've dropped like breadcrumbs through it?
Yeah.
You can never really know in the editing room as the filmmaker when the audience is going to pick up on that. You craft it in a way using your best judgment to try and have the awareness seep in at the moment that you want it to. But the thing is, you already know what the ending is, so you can't sit there and experience the film for the audience. So until you actually end up on the screen and somebody or somebody's ideally see it and have a reaction to it, it is fundamentally kind of hard to know whether you hit things right when you are operating on a bit of a more subtle wavelength in terms of your storytelling.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, that's really the pivotal point of it all. And I think, just to put a bow on this, and this is a silly question, but I always like to ask it to people, because we all come in as fans, and I always like to ask about the desert island movies, but because you're a short filmmaker, could you pick a desert island short film if you had to?
I think, that's a tougher one. I haven't gotten that question before, but I think if it probably had to come down to it, it would be Nails, the 1979 documentary by Philip Borsos that was produced by the National Film Board. That it was Canada's submission at the 1980 Academy Awards for Best Live Action Short. It didn't win, but it should have. And it's this great, completely wordless, almost entirely characterless documentary about the industrial process of making nails in the 1970s. Where only the nails and the machinery itself are the characters. So it's basically like an elaborate technical masterpiece music video before MTV even really existed. And that was the first film when I saw it. I was probably, I don't know, in my early double digits when I first saw it. That was the first Canadian product that I had seen, a piece of cinema. So not 80s Canadian television, but an actual piece of 80s, 70s, 80s Canadian filmmaking that sort of galvanized me, forgive the pun, in the awareness that it is attainable to be a filmmaker and to also make short films in Canada. It was the first thing that sort of jumped out at me that wasn't animation, that said, yeah, there are people making really interesting, really unconventional short films right now who are Canadian, who have careers and are making interesting movies. And that was the first film when I was, really young that gave me the idea that would be a possibility, that I could maybe be a short filmmaker. Because before that, my only experience with film was with features, because by and large, that's the large majority of what's available to any of us as viewers, both historically and contemporaneously. So Nails was sort of the first film for me that was like, oh no, there are also people who are doing this at a much smaller, much more attainable, and much more local scale. And I can do that too. There's nothing stopping me from doing that. So I think if I had to pick one short film that I was going to take on an island with me for an eternity of banishment, I think it would probably be Nails by Philip Borsos.
Well, and you know what? You can officially add yourself to those ranks, because you are making interesting films and you've got a career and you're working hard, and keep up the good work, man. Thank you for the time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Do you mind if I just quickly drop some information about our
do it, please.
Premiere? So Reciever is actually going to be premiering at the Real Asian International Film Festival on November 12th. It is streaming in the Film Frenzy program and streams the entire duration of the film festival, starting on November 12th at 10 a.m. and running all the way until the end of the day on November 19th. I will be taking part along with Tare Vejdani, who's the lead in Reciever. We will be taking part in a live Q&A on November 15th at 10 a.m. That is free for all ticket holders. And if anybody's interested in looking up other of my work, I can be found at www.interlockpictures.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Interlock Pictures. And if you want to hear me noodling on Twitter, you can find me at CCAM Operator.
And you know what? That's proof positive that if you think you've broken Netflix, there's still plenty of stuff out there to watch. So go support independent filmmaking, go support short filmmaking, go support Real Asian, go support festivals in general, because These people need it, and especially during these times. And, thank you again for the work, and thanks for the time today.
No, thank you. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Cheers, man.
Thanks.
All right.